So I'm really happy to tackle the biggest part of the pie now, our supply chain. And we're very lucky to have Heidi Barnard here, who's the sustainability lead at NHS Supply Chain. Heidi, thank you so much.
Hello. So, sorry, Pete, I am your worst nightmare. I am an economist. So there are two books I would fully recommend that anybody reads. They are Donut Economics by Kate Raworth and There's No Profit on a Dead Planet by Mark Shaler. Two incredible books that kind of bring to life the economic reality of the climate crisis. So, moving on from that, I'm going to talk to you today about the approach NHS Supply Chain is taking to the climate crisis, amongst many other things, but in a way that is really specific about what it is we're asking from our supply chain and what the minimum expectation is going forward from us if you want to work with us. So just out of interest, how many people are actually suppliers or want to supply into the NHS? Okay, so a fairly good chunk. And how many people actually understand what NHS Supply Chain is? Not so many. Okay. So a very brief synopsis. So NHS Supply Chain are an organisation that procure and are a contracting authority for the NHS, but also we do a lot of the logistics. So we also procure product, stock it and ship it into the NHS. So that's us in a nutshell. There's a lot more I could go on. There's probably a 3-hour talk on that alone, but I won't bore you with that. So the way that we are approaching it is I've been talking about the 5 asks for a while now, and this is to really crystallise as simply as possible what it is as NHS Supply Chain we want from our suppliers and what the expectation is going to be if you want to get onto one of our frameworks. So some of this should be fairly familiar for those that have been supplying into the NHS for a while. It aligns with the NHS England supplier roadmap. So again, if you've been following that, some of this will be very familiar. But it does go further. So I've got a number of slides today. I'm going to talk through the 5 asks as an overview, and then I'm going to go into each of them in a little bit more detail, but not too much. So the first one is carbon reduction plan. You have to have one, end of. The second is social value. So there is a requirement for all procurements to have a 10% minimum social value weighting when it comes to NHS procurement. We've done quite a lot of work in this last year to really crystallise what the expectation is when it comes to procurements through NHS Supply Chain. The third one is the Evergreen Assessment. Now this was launched in June this year, and for all NHS Supply Chain frameworks it is mandatory. We've included the NHS supply roadmap on here, and this isn't something that's necessarily evaluated as part of the procurement, but it's about future understanding. So it's not just about the roadmap itself, but it's also thinking about understanding over the course of one of our agreements what's going to be happening. So there's a lot of change in the world of sustainability, and if you think about the context in which we operate, we have DEFRA policy, we have DHSE policy. I know one of our frameworks usually lasts between 3 and 4 years. Over the course of the next 3 to 4 years, there will be changes. So if we think from DEFRA's point of view, there's currently consultation that's just closed around wet wipes and banning plastics in them. So again, from a business point of view, what does that mean for NHS Supply Chain and what does it mean for our customers? There's one due on batteries, and again, if you think about the millions of items that we put into the NHS on a feels like daily basis, again, what's the impact of that going to be, and what does that outlook look like over the next 3 to 4 years? And the final item I'm going to talk about is around modern slavery, and again, the approach that we're taking for a number of reasons and why that's evolving. So carbon reduction plans. So I'm not going to go into lots of detail about the technical requirements of a carbon reduction plan. There is much on the internet that you can read about it. But what I want to be really clear about is what we're actually evaluating when we look at them. We're not actually looking at the numbers. This is about making sure that everybody is on the journey and they understand their own numbers. And when we evaluate them, what we're looking to do is make sure that you've put in the things that we need. So have you got a commitment? have you got your baseline numbers and your last year's reporting numbers? And if you don't, what are you doing to get that information, and how are you looking to improve it over the next year? What actions you're taking, and also, has it been signed off? Do you have it on your website? And yes, we do check. And is it updated? So it has to be, at its oldest, a year old. So again, that is another thing that we will be checking. From a social value perspective, we spent a lot of time over the last 18 months trying to come up with questions that are proportionate and appropriate as per the guidance. But when you're procuring something from a framework, you could potentially have thousands of products across quite a broad sector. So trying to write a proportionate and appropriate question for everything from a suture to a dressing to a syringe can be very difficult. And we have struggled with this. There's also been some additional requirements this year around modern slavery and incorporating a social value question linked to that in higher and medium risk procurements. So again, we needed to incorporate that into our thinking around how we set social value questions. So we've come up with a tool, and basically our buyers select from a drop-down their framework. It will spit out the risk from a modern slavery perspective. It will tell them which tools they need to apply for that, and it will then tell them which 2 social value questions to ask from this list that you can see before you. The first question will always be asked. So again, from the NHS perspective, we always have to have a question on fighting climate change. As I said, from a modern slavery perspective, anything that's medium or high risk has to have a social value question on that, which just leaves our low risk. So one of if you are procuring for a low risk, what will be in the second question will be one of the others. So hopefully that makes sense. When it comes to the evergreen assessment, we ummed and ahed for quite a while about how to incorporate it into what we were doing. And in the end, it actually became very simple. We'd already got a requirement across all of our agreements about completing a carbon waste and water assessment. So it was quite simple that actually we just replaced that with evergreen. Head scratching over. So we wrote out in August to all of our suppliers to say, as of the 1st of February, you have to have an evergreen assessment. We're not looking for a particular level at this point. We just need to have everybody across that first hurdle. So if you're an existing supplier, your bidding team have had the email. Clock is ticking. 1st of February is not that far away anymore. But also, if you're looking to get onto a framework, you will have to have an assessment at the SQ stage. So crack on. The other thing I'd say about it is that, and I will keep repeating this, we are not looking for a level at this point in time. What we're looking to do is understand where our supply chain is. I haven't got a team of 4. I can't do everything, so I need to know where the gaps are to work out what we need to do, and this is a great way for me to find that out. I've mentioned it before, and I'll mention it again. The NHS England supply roadmap is a key part of the driver behind some of what we're doing. And what I really want people to focus on is to begin to think about the 2027 and the 2028 targets. And particularly when you're writing your answer to social value question number 1 about what you're going to be doing over the next 3 to 4 years, maybe referencing what is coming and how you're working towards that would be a really good way to answer that question. And the final bit, which I've left a little bit longer to talk about, is modern slavery. So there have been a number of work streams over the last few years looking at our approach to and how we tackle modern slavery within our supply chains. We know there are risks, but as an organisation, we had historically 11 category towers that were outsourced, and all had kind of approached it in their own way, which means we had at least 11, usually more, ways of tackling it within the procurement. Which is okay, however, it doesn't really help our supply chain, particularly if there are multiple frameworks and have to do different things for different teams. One of the other things about it is it makes it really difficult to really keep a grip on what's going on and really understand where our risk is. Earlier this year, there was a PPN released called PPN 0223, which is all about how you tackle modern slavery within public procurement. And what that did fundamentally was shift part of what we're doing when it comes to risk assessment. So historically, when you talk about modern slavery, you talk about risk assessment, you're risk assessing a supply chain that is in place. So you know who your suppliers are, you know what the markets are, and you assess based on that. What the PPN does is it asks you to look at risk much earlier in the procurement cycle. So before you even know who your suppliers are, it's asking you to look at the potential risk of a particular procurement. And this is what I alluded to earlier around that tool and the social value tool we've developed. Part of the driver behind that was coming up with a methodology to look at all of our procurements and think about how we're going to risk assess them and what that methodology looks like in order to be able to apply a risk level and apply the appropriate due diligence-based tools to that. So it's quite simple in terms of the risk level. So across all of our frameworks, there are 3 risk levels: low, medium, and high. If it is a low-risk procurement, you're required to do a MSAT. So literally every single one of our frameworks will require to as a minimum have completed an MSAT. At medium level, you have to do an MSAT plus a social value question. And at the highest level, you have to do an MSAT, a social value question, and a third-party audit. So that gets you to point number 3. At point number 3, that's when we get those answers back, and we have to evaluate them to understand individual risk. So I might have a framework that is high risk, but the suppliers might be low risk because they're well aware of what's going on in their industry, they have all the management processes in place, they are understanding what they're doing, and they have clear visibility through their supply chain and are able to demonstrate that. Conversely, I might have a low-risk framework, but actually a high-risk supplier because they have no clue what they're doing and they've not got any policies or processes in place to manage or understand potential risks within their supply chain. So if you're low risk, excellent, carry on through. If you're medium risk, we have to make sure that we have all the appropriate clauses and terms and conditions in place to satisfy that risk, and also any KPIs that were identified within the social value question are included in the agreement. If you're high risk, this is the point at which we have to take a step back and ask if this is really a company we want to contract with. There may be cases where it is, which is why there's not an outright ban at that point, but it's about we have to take a step back and have a long conversation about understanding that risk and understanding what taking that risk on means. We then carry on through the process, and we've also put in place a process around how to manage if any allegations or reports come in during the life of the contract. I'm not going to dwell on this in too much detail, but the approach is very much one of being victim-centric. So rather than a knee-jerk stopping everything at that point, it's about taking a victim-centric approach and understanding the impact of any actions we take and what that's going to mean for the victim, and how do we make life better for the victim and not necessarily what we're going to do for the company. We then move on through the process as we would in any other normal contract. So hopefully that's been quite helpful. I think that is my last slide. I think we'll leave the questions to the Q&A.